Okay, this is our second PowerPoint, our second series of PowerPoints for week 9. I hope you guys are surviving this change to online media, online classes. I don't think it's not going to end this semester, and I'm not sure what's going to happen in the fall. So we'll see where we are with this whole virus outbreak. So I hope you're doing well. I hope no one's sick. But I'll try to be available as much as possible. Again, don't hesitate to email me, request a Zoom meeting. We'll figure it out. So don't be stressful over this. We'll figure out ways to make this easier. Again, I'm posting a non-narrated PowerPoint of this, so you can follow the links. It's just too hard for me to switch back and forth and get some kind of consistency in the movie and not make it really heavy and long. So we are on what's technically Thursday's first PowerPoint. We're going to look at dialects done wrong, like what people often say about dialects. We'll look at some linguistic ways to actually consider the validity of dialects and how they differ from standard English, including what is standard English. And I'll give you some ideas on some paper topics as well. So again, I've tried to embed this little green caption symbol here so you'll know where you can go to the links on the non-narrated PowerPoint. So a lot of misconceptions stem from who actually speaks a dialect. And of course, most of you by this time know that everybody speaks a dialect of some sort. That it's not those people who speak a dialect or those people who live in a certain area or who have a certain education level or are isolated from bigger cities. Everyone speaks a dialect version of the standard English or of the standard language. So dialects of American English are many, and we're going to look at specifically at different how those different dialects arose. And so if you go to this website, you'll be able to hear one guy who's really good at doing dialects across the U.S. As well as other dialects. It's kind of fun to watch. I wish I could do this, but it's not my talent. Okay, so what do we think when we hear dialects? Well, a lot of people do think that it is regionally located, and dialects do have a lot to do with regional differences. You can trace the borders of where one dialect ends and one dialect begins, often by geographical barriers such as mountains, lakes, rivers. But this is not the only differentiation. Some people only describe the sounds they hear. So they'll say, oh, those people speak a dialect, they have a certain twang or slowness or quickness to their speech, or they leave off certain letters. And then they oftentimes people make characterizations about people who speak dialects. So if you notice in the third bullet, people often describe people who speak a Southern dialect as friendly, hospitable. They like all those darlings and sweethearts in there. But then when you go up to like New York or Boston, and that dialect speed, the tempo gets a little faster. They're a little more direct. People often will call them rude, not friendly. All kinds of social characteristics are imported to the people who speak different dialects. Also, people will often confuse slang use with dialects. So every generation has its own slang. That's a characteristic of slang, is that it's very local, it's very timely. It goes away with the next generation. The slang you speak is not the same as the slang your grandparents spoke. Is not the same as what their grandparents spoke. So sometimes dialect is confused with the use of slang. And then the other negative and improper characterization of a dialect is that it's just some kind of substandard, illiterate, uneducated way to speak proper English. So, for example, here's some dialect versions: 3 mile instead of 3 miles. So you see the plural marker is absent in the first column for a single count for a noun. Her ears be itching. Notice that we have the bare infinitive form of the copula used as the main verb instead of just using the noun phrase with a more lexical verb. Her ears itch. She done grew up, for she's grown up. So we have all these kinds of differences from standard English that occur in dialects. So from a linguistic perspective, dialect is a neutral label. It just refers to any variety of a language that is shared by a group of speakers. So that can be that grouping can be geographical. It can be a regional. It could be an identity thing, but it's neutral. It has no positive, negative connotations. And so we really focus on sharing this notion that we all speak a dialect, and so to judge or have biases against people who have a dialect is kind of inappropriate in a lot of ways, but it's in part because we all do it. So we're going to look at a variety of dialects, but here's some that you probably recognize the terminology. So of course Southern drawl, but you have the New York accent or New Yorkese, Bostonian, Pittsburghese. A lot of research done on Pittsburghese, California surfer or Valley girl, and then there are others. For your homework, you will contribute to a wiki. You'll choose one of these dialects. I have a list of others on the homework in the homework folder with some sources. You have a dialect map that will also give you some more options to choose from, and then you'll contribute by giving us some characteristics of that dialect that will add to our body of knowledge and be part of our testable information. So I think it'll be a fun homework this week. I think it'll be low stress and kind of interesting for you to explore, and it might give you some ideas for papers. And I'll keep adding to your paper repertoire options. So our view is that there is no inherently good or bad dialect. That dialect is how we simply refer to variety in language of a single language, and that we do know that the one that is socially favored, the one that we use for academic groups, for academic use, for publication, laws, newspapers, any kind of thing like that, is the privileged variety, and that other varieties, those non-standard ones, the ones that violate or differentiate from standard English, are often stigmatized, that they have bias imported to them and the speakers who use them. Dialects affect all levels of language use. So even though this class is mostly about syntax, we're going to encounter issues where phonology, that's usually what people think of as how someone sounds different than they do as being the dialect marker. Things like, we'll talk a little bit about postvocalic R, people who say idea, the standard version, and then people who add an R at the end, idea. This was my grandparents, and a lot of people who still speak dialects versions in North Carolina, South Carolina, a lot of the South, Appalachia, we'll add that R, that post-vocalic R. Do you have differences when you say pin and pen? To me, those sound like two very different words, but many places in the U.S., pin and pin or pen and pen are the same word for two different things. We'll look at a little bit of morphological differences, how people add affixes, particularly in fitting them into syntax, not so much in word formation, but in fitting the word into its syntax. The variation in what they use often signals their dialect. And of course, then we'll focus a lot on syntax. So here I have in the green, that first one, the dog, he bit the man. This is a version of New Orleans dialect. It's called a Yat dialect. I haven't included any sources on our website about this, but it's a really fascinating New Orleans dialect, which Louisiana has, or Louisiana has all kinds of different dialects, and Yat specifically targets the 9th district of New Orleans, and so they have some variation even within the city. And of course, lexicon. What words do you use for certain items? Of course, we know the differences between British and American English, things like lift for elevator or lorry for truck. But even within the U.S., we have a lot of variation. Poke for bag, but there's all kinds of differences in the words that we use to call things. So again, dialects, they affect all versions, not just pronunciation. For us, if you're just talking about pronunciation differences, this is the actual term for accent when it's only about pronunciation. But if we're talking about changes, variation between dialects, between morphology, vocabulary, pronunciation, and syntax, then we're talking about a dialect. So the status of a dialect, ones that are looked at as being more intelligent sounding, less intelligent sounding, rednecky, illiterate, sexy, all of these things are just arbitrary. So we import on that through our own social status and the collection of our views as a society and subsections of our society. Now, when we look globally at dialects, often the statement is given that a language has an army, a navy and an army, and a dialect is something different. So what does that mean? It really is talking about the standard version of the language will have power behind it. And so sometimes dialects are mutually unintelligible. We know that dialects will start with the same standard language, like Chinese, but we know within that the dialects of, say, Mandarin and Cantonese are virtually unintelligible to each other. They cannot communicate because they varied so much. So when do we finally say that they are distinct languages? That takes some analysis to do, but so far we still say Mandarin and Cantonese are dialects of Chinese, even though speakers cannot understand each other, and that's an interesting area to look at. Both terms dialect and language are very politically and socially loaded. So note that a lot of issues of power, a lot of issues of social status come into play when we talk about these two words. Now here, there's 3 different embedded links on here. And so I would ask you to explore these with the non-narrated PowerPoint, and you'll get a better idea of, one, what dialects are in the U.S., what dialects are as opposed to language. And then also people's social perceptions. That second one, American Dialects, this is Dennis Preston's work. It's very interesting. It's a nice clip about how he goes around and asks people and tries to get at what he calls their folk linguistic understanding of dialects and these social characterizations of them. So that's a really interesting piece of research that he's done and that you could possibly recreate for your paper. So do watch that. And then the last one is just something fun to watch about how Hollywood sees dialects. You'll hear a lot of dialects in movies and TV shows, and rarely are they completely accurate. So people who study phonology and dialects in particular can do a much nicer analysis of this than what we're able to do at this point. So after you watch particularly the second video clip, ask yourself if you agree with the characterizations of different areas, dialect areas of the U.S., and then think about what dialects are made fun of in movies, in TV, in comedy, and also in your own social communities. And why do we think that these things are funny? So I'll leave this one to you. Now if we just talk a little bit about standard English. So we've been talking about dialects and variations. So what is the standard? Again, it's an arbitrary decision. Prescriptive powers, people who are publishers, people who are educators, who write dictionaries, they determine what are the rules of our standard, what makes the most perfect, and let me put that in like scare quotes, perfect form of the language. And it tends to be the language used by power, so government, people with money, socially respected groups. But even socially respected groups who speak a non-standard can have a different kind of power. If you think about the power of, say, hip-hop or rap music, definitely non-standard versions, but has a lot of social power and social collateral in our society, as do other non-standard forms. Statistically, it's the most frequently occurring forms, but I would caveat this and say in published venues, in written form, not so much in spoken. And it's a form imposed on those of us who use it. So definitely the language that we're taught to use in academic settings, in school language, in professional language, and this is what will be considered standard. So here's just a nice working definition of standard. So if you are going to do a paper on some kind of dialect use or variation use, having a standard definition is particularly important. And then here's standard British from Strevens. I think I have the citation on the end of this slide show. Again, in England, just as students are in America, they're taught the RP form, and so a very standard form in school. But it's not particularly linked to any specific accent. Now, I would say American Standard English is kind of linked to Midland dialect or Midland accent, and that's what I speak. So the middle part of the country, think Midwest, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, sort of Kentucky, most people speak a Midland, and then you have those outer regions that speak more like of a Southern or Appalachian. And so we also know that Standard English has some global currency, that there are a huge number of people out in the world, China, India, parts of Central and South America, all over learning English because it has such power. and they are changing our language as well. So although Standard English is the accepted form, it is the one that is the educational target. No single accent really feels this equivalent. The closest, like I said, is the Midland dialect, but in some sense, it doesn't mean that anything is better or best. It's just designated for a particular purpose, or for particular purposes like education, professions, publications. And most of us move between standard and some other dialect, particularly if you're educated. So you have your standard dialect that you use, your standard language that you use in those academic and professional settings. But when you get around your friends and family, you will go back to your home dialect. There's lots of research out there showing when lawyers and doctors and politicians go back to their home communities, that language will switch back to their dialect variation. And we also use it very strategically in social circumstances. So you will see even politicians switch even to a dialect that's not their own when they're in that community. So if you read Wolfram and Schilling's chapter, the entire book is online. If you want to search for it, you can find a whole version of it. And it kind of does track the U.S. Dialects across. It gives you a lot of nice information if you're going to use to write a paper about dialects versus standard. And they really talk about how it is, the social import of dialects, what it is we listen to when we hear a person speak, and it's how they say things has more influence over our assessment of that person than does the content of their speech. So this our judgment from nearly the first moment that someone starts to talk to us. Our judgments become about, well, where are they from regionally? What are their social, how high on the social ladder are they? How wealthy are they? What's their ethnicity? And what's their education level? If you have read or will read that Scharinger et al. Research article, you will see that that placing someone in an MRI and watching what the brain does when a person hears even the smallest soundbite of the word hello, all of these factors come into play, as does a visual image of that person. So it is that quick. In milliseconds, you already have a judgment of what that person looks like, who that person is, and all of these social elements. I always ask when we look at this in an upper level linguistic course is, why would that be? Why does the human brain do that so quickly? What purpose does this serve? So we know that, as we've seen in the Old English to Middle English to Modern English or present day English, we've seen language change. Here's a piece from the Lord's Prayer. It's something that we have the earliest written documentation of, so we can trace language change through these things that we have the written forms of. So you can see Old English form, Middle English, Early Middle English to Modern English or present day. So language changes. Yet, if you study the quotations on this slide, all through history and across all cultures and languages, people criticize the language that they have today as being somehow inferior to the language of older times. So the battle continues. If you really want to watch a very interesting modern day take on this, this is John McWhorter's 2013 TED Talk, so you can access this through the non-narrated PowerPoint. And here, of course, the criticism is that text languages text language between younger people particularly is ruining standard English, or English as we know it. So he takes that on. So also a good source, if this interests you. I would say that you could write a paper by looking at the language of texting, of Instagram or blogs, some medium where you know the language is different than standard English. So a paper that would look like that would take this form would be a study of the language of, let's say, texting. You might even limit that. I know I've had people who have done not just Instagrams, but done small communities of Instagram users or blog users, or one student did a paper on the real Instagrams versus the fake Instagrams of high school students. That was really interesting. But it would look like something like this. Your starting question would be, something about how this form of language, this very narrow form you're going to study, is different than standard English. I've also included in here that it may not be in the print form. You might study the language of, say, you work at Starbucks and you know that there's a certain language that has developed because you're communicating about a very specific topic, or you're a rock climber, you're a caver, or you participate in some kind of sport. This small community will have its own language. I think one of my students was a dancer, and so she looked at how dance language in the dance classroom differed from standard English. That was really interesting. So again, you kind of set it up. Of course, you'll have an intro and thesis. I always write those last because no need to spend any time on that till I've actually done the research and I've written the paper. You'll have a background section. This is part of the extended intro. So you have that first typical paragraph that I'm sure many of you are very comfortable writing. But then you have a background section. This sort of defines the community that you're studying. It could define the language, if it's been studied in any way by other people. So a little bit of a literature review about if you found anybody else who studied this, what they currently know, and then you're going to add to that body of knowledge. And then if you're going to analyze language, then you have to explain your method. How did you collect the data? How did you seek out that language? How did you isolate it? Was there a time limit that you were going to look at language use on this medium for 1 week? Were you going to witness, observe the language in use for so many hours? Say like so many hours of a dance class, you went 3 times, 3 hours, and so you really want to describe how you collected that data. And then your results section, straight raw data. You found X uses of these nouns, or this grammatical structure, or these nouns varied from standard English, and giving us just that raw data. Sometimes it will be percentages, like you notice that the language varied in noun production 16% of the time, or in the verbal structure differed. Very much just raw data. It's not until the next section, this analysis section, that you start to make sense of it, and you start to really describe what you see going on here. This is where you do your analysis, your more thorough analysis of the differences between the language you studied and standard English, and then the discussion section really talks about, well, what do we do with this information? How is this important? So how is this language changing? Could it change standard English? Could these forms infiltrate standard English, and how might that happen, or do you see that happening already? And then you'll have a reference page of straight APA. So language differences are unavoidable. It's just part of our use of language. And so formal standard language is in itself a variety of standard of English, and it's based on the language, primarily the written language. It's been codified by textbooks, by guidebooks, by educational materials. It's perpetuated in schools, and it is the conservative, resistant version. Informal is any variety that differs significantly from standard. It exists on a continuum because there's so many of them. It's flexible. It changes. It's located by regions or identity or geography, and then you can actually study the differences. So this continuum between standard and some people will not vary so much, like Midland dialect doesn't vary so much from standard. But then as we look at other dialect versions, such as Pittsburghese or Southern dialect or Appalachian, we move in a pretty acceptable direction towards non-standardness. And again, strong affective. This is the one form of affect that is psychological. It's an emotional response that we have. If you notice, there's a whole bunch of labels that we once used for African American English, and you can see how each of them have a social connotation. That is also true for Latino or Latina English, Chicano, Hispanic, Cholo. You have California talk, Valley talk, surfer talk, all have a different social connotation. You can think of other ones that you might have heard for Appalachian or Bostonian that may not be that may have different social connotations to them. If you click on that, you will get the map of dialects that will also give you some more information about terms in case you want to research an area that I don't have any uploaded information on, but you might get a term here and then do your own research, or it might influence what you actually write your paper on. In this one, if you click on that link in the non-narrated PowerPoint, you can test yourself and see what do people say, what kind of accent do you, or what kind of dialect do you speak. And so then the next PowerPoint will look at the history of and current status of U.S. dialects and some more paper examples. So I'm going to end this one.